Good morning. Welcome everyone to the US EPA Brownfields Grant Writing Strategies webinar. My name is Dan Cholker and I'm the lead Brownfields coordinator here at Ohio EPA. We are very pleased to partner with Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or KSU TAB, and US EPA to provide you with this training over the next 2 half-day sessions. We are excited to provide this in-depth look at US EPA's Brownfield grants to provide you with tips and tools to prepare an application. Federal grant funds are at their highest levels ever, and now is the time for communities to address their brownfields. Next slide, please. We have a number of experts who will be sharing their experience with us over the next 2 days. First, Roxanne Anderson, the Director for Region 5 at KSU TAB, will cover housekeeping and logistics for this webinar. After that, an overview of the various US EPA Brownfield grants will be provided by Amy Ursovich, a KSU TAB partner. Then Carla Acker, a US EPA project coordinator, will go over this year's federal Brownfield grants and things we should know. Next, we will walk through 2 of 4 sections of the US EPA grant application. Amy Ursovich and Beth Grigsby, Assistant Director and TAB partner, will present and lead this discussion. Also, we have assembled a panel of experts to provide firsthand knowledge and advice that include myself, Carla Acker, Sally Gladwell, a Senior Vice President, Senior Principal with the Manick and Smith Group, Melissa Zoller, Planning Director, and Kate Dunn, Senior Planner, both from Buckeye Hills Regional Council. Following the presentation, we will work through a group exercise, including breakout rooms, to do a deep dive into an actual application. We will end day 1 with groups reporting back. We will continue tomorrow with more tips and tools and walking through sections 3 and 4 of the grant application. I'm hopeful that the information provided over the next 2 days will give you the tools you need to prepare a US EPA grant application for brownfield funding. Now is a great opportunity to leverage these resources to help tackle brownfield redevelopment in your community. And with that, I will turn it over to Roxanne.
Thanks, Dan. I have a few quick technical points to go over just before we get started. If you have technical difficulties with your connection, please call 785-200-7005 or email chsr@ksu.edu, and someone should be able to assist you. We are recording this workshop today, and the recording along with presentation slides will be available on the KSU TAB website where you registered for this event within the next few days or by the end of the week. And that link will be shared again in the chat box. Just a few quick reminders also to ensure a pleasant experience for everyone. All participants are automatically muted and your videos are turned off, but we would like for this session to be as interactive as possible. So we encourage you to ask questions through the event, throughout the event today using the chat feature located in the Zoom toolbar. To make sure we're able to verify your attendance, please change your participant name to match the name you used for registration. You can do this by clicking on the participant's icon, also in the Zoom toolbar. And when the list of participants comes up, you can locate yourself, click on the More button, and select Rename. And then a new box should appear asking you to enter your new screen name. For those of you who are not familiar with KSU TAB, we are one of 6 technical assistance programs in the United States funded by a US EPA grant. The TAB service providers provide free services that are tailored to specific needs in planning, economic development, and environmental challenges with brownfields. Kansas State University covers US EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. One of those free services that KSU TAB provides are educational webinars and workshops that help communities with various challenges like the one today focused on grant writing. It's extremely important for us to hear from participants so we can continuously improve and keep our content relevant. At the end of today's event, please take some time to fill out the brief survey about your experience. You can pull it up now using the link or the QR code so that you do not forget. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Amy Ursovich.
Thanks, Roxanne. Excuse me. I'm Amy Ursovich. As Roxanne mentioned, I'm one of the TAB partners. with KSU tab, and today I'm going to be talking about the grants that will be available this fall when they issue the grant announcement and grant guidelines. They are the assessment, and there's three different types of those: the cleanup and the RLF, or Revolving Loan Fund grants. Next. If you were at the webinar yesterday, I did go over the legal definition of brownfields, but we'll hit that another time. I think it's important to know that both the federal government and many states, including the state of Ohio, do have their own definition of brownfields. The federal one is listed right here. The thing to keep in mind is that they contain information, they contain certain commonalities, and that's real property that is probably ripe for expansion or redevelopment or reuse, but it is complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances. So it's a concern for liability as a result of the potential, if not actual, presence of contamination. Next slide. So why do we redevelop brownfields? Well, number one, it makes financial sense. There is funding available. When the public law for brownfields was passed in 2002, not only did it provide for a liability scheme for brownfield type properties to do some due diligence and maintain the property and keep yourself free from CERCLA type or Superfund type liability, but also it made available funding for assessment, cleanup, remedial planning, and other activities. Keep in mind that there is also funding at the local level or state level. Many states will offer grant programs or programs such as Ohio's Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program, where they have contractors that will go out and do phase 1 and phase 2 type work and provide you with a report at the end of the day. Existing infrastructure is another reason for redeveloping brownfields. Where there are properties that have existed for many years, chances are they have sewer, they have water, they have other infrastructure, and have location and transportation often associated with them. And when you, as opposed to going to a green field, a grassy field, or any type of open versus redeveloping something that has already been there, you're going to reduce the amount of impervious surface expansion, and that can be up to 80%. Just to let you know that since 2002, when US EPA has been issuing grants for brownfields, 21.07 cents have been leveraged for each brownfield dollar awarded, and 11.2 jobs have been created for each $100,000 in EPA funds spent. So they're leveraging a lot of dollars and other benefits with this money. Next slide. Applicant eligibility. So private entities are not eligible for these grants. It's generally local units of government, states, tribes. They have made changes so that nonprofit organizations, 501c3 nonprofits, can also be eligible to apply for grant funding. So there's a big list of public entities or nonprofit entities that can apply for these grants. Next slide. So site eligibility. Some of the questions you may want to ask if you have a site in mind, or in the case of assessment grants, such as community-wide or state grants, you may be having priority sites, which Beth and I will talk about a little bit later on in this webinar, in mind. And what you want to keep in mind is, do they meet the brownfield definition? And do they have any environmental enforcement actions? And that can be at the federal or the state level. So contacting your regional EPA contact or someone such as Dan Joker, who started this webinar today, and some of his coworkers might be able to help you determine that if you don't know. Have you owned or do you own the property? That can sometimes cause eligibility issues. And how did you acquire the property? And most importantly, have you caused or contributed to any contamination on the site? That's going to have a big effect on whether, if you have caused that, whether you're eligible or not. And there's a lot of different types of substances that can be addressed, from hazardous to petroleum to asbestos and lead-based paint, controlled substances, and mine-scarred lands. Next slide. So as I mentioned, these are the grants that will be offered. This particular grant round, known as the fiscal year 25 grants, I did want to correct that on the title slide. It is actually FY25 that the grant rounds will open in September, and they will be assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup grants. There are state, tribal, and community-wide assessment grants. They can pay for preliminary investigations, typically known as phase 1 investigations, sampling and analysis, and other activities, typically known as phase 2 investigations, and cleanup or redevelopment planning. I'll go over to cleanup grants. For sites with well-defined environmental contamination, you pretty much have to have a phase 1 and a pretty full phase 2 in order to qualify for a cleanup grant. And these pay for remedial activities, which can include engineering controls such as barriers or groundwater treatment, or institutional controls such as deed restrictions or zoning restrictions. The revolving loan funds grants, we won't spend too much time on. These are typically for organizations that have a lot of experience in real estate funding and loan operation, but they will, a lot of times they're operated at the state level or regional level, but just so you know, these are often out there, I know in Ohio and other states, and they provide the funding for a grant, and that is set up so some of the money can be subgranted to eligible entities, public entities, and also private entities can apply for low interest loans, and their payback will go back into the fund, hence revolving. Next slide. Assessment grants. They are for conducting environmental investigations, as I mentioned. Some of the things you can do utilizing these is determine if site cleanup is necessary and prepare cleanup plans, site reuse assessments, and these are some of the things that TAB can also help with some of our experts. So site reuse assessments, market studies to find out what might be best fit if you're looking for retail or industry. Infrastructure evaluations, what do you have there? What shape is it in? And revitalization plans. Next slide. Types of assessment grants. First, we have our community-wide grants that will be offered, and these are good for communities that are beginning to address their brownfield challenges, as well as communities that have an established brownfields program and they want to continue to redevelop their brownfields in their targeted areas, underprivileged areas, things like that. They are, instead of actually focusing on just one specific site, you're going to have some priority sites. You have to name at least one in your grant application. But once that money is spent, you're going to be spending these typically on anywhere from 6 to 10 to 12 sites where you're doing assessments. These can go up to $500,000 in a request, and the period of performance, the grant performance years, is 4. Next slide. Coalition assessment grants. This is where you have a lead And that particular lead in the coalition has experience working with assessments grants. Generally, they're going to be a regional or a state or an entity, as I mentioned, with a lot of experience doing these grants. And so they can be a state, county, regional council, group of general purpose units of government, or a tribe. And they will bring in 2 to 4 non-lead partners, coalition partners, who they will work together with to actually conduct the grant project, the work on this grant in all the areas, both lead and non-lead. Applicants can request up to $1.2 million. And again, the period of performance is 4 years. Next slide.
Amy.
Mhm.
This is Carla. Can I just
Yes.
add one little thing to what you said?
Uh,
Just one
Absolutely.
kind of sort of clarifying point. Land banks are eligible entities, just in case anyone is wondering about that. They're eligible entities to be lead coalition members. We put them under the county as a county agency.
Thank you. That is good. And we do have land banks that have been lead coalition grantees. So thank you for that clarification or add on, Carla. Next slide. Community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. State of Ohio has had one of these, and I believe they may be applying for another one. And this allows them to pick certain areas of the state or the tribal area as their targeted areas and work to do assessments similar to like a community-wide assessment grant, with the exception that they have a bigger pool of money to work with. It's 2 million, up to 2 million. And they have a little bit longer time to spend that money, which is 5 years. Next slide. Cleanup grants. So you need to make sure that you've done all your assessment work right and your site is eligible. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about that, Beth and I, as later on in this webinar. They allow for cleanup plan preparation, remedial activities. So that can be anything from soil excavation to asbestos removal, construction of engineering controls. You may have an asphalt cap over soils that may be contaminated. Development and filing of institutional controls. So any type of deed restriction, land use restriction, that will help pay for getting that put together and actually filing it. There are different pots of money. Carla will talk a little bit more in detail next about these, but applicants can request up to 500,000, up to 2 million. And it used to be 4 million, but I'll let Carla talk about what the FY25 pots of money are because she'll be presenting next. Can't be funds, big thing, can't use your funds for investigation. You can do confirmatory sampling. So if you're cleaning up soils, groundwater, things like that, you can do confirmatory sampling, and that can be paid for by the grant. Next slide. Some of the things to keep in mind with that cleanup grant, it have to do with whether you own the site, whether you've been in the chain of title, is the site eligible? Again, contacting your EPA regional folks are going to help. Carla can talk a little bit more about that as well. And Beth and I will probably get into that as the day progresses. Again, having that complete phase 1 and phase 2 investigation to make sure that the property has been completely assessed and the cleanup goals and are are correct, and the money that you're asking for is actually going to clean this property up. It can provide gap funding in the case of a really expensive cleanup. They can leverage state cleanup resources. Oftentimes, if you've got EPA putting in that money, they'll be looking good to a bank or other funders. and it can demonstrate a federal resource commitment to developers, lenders, and other agencies. Next slide. Again, we'll move on. That's just making sure that your site is characterized thoroughly. You're going to have a letter from Dan and company from Ohio EPA that will go along with your application if you're applying for a cleanup grant. Next slide. Revolving loan funds. Again, I'm not going to speak a whole lot about these, but they are, set up so that agencies and organizations with lending experience, real estate experience can actually provide loans and subgrants. Again, subgrants for public entities, loans typically very low interest for private entities, and that payback is revolved back into the loan. Next slide. And that's it for my presentation. Feel free to contact us, Roxanne or myself, if you have any questions about any grant issues or anything like that in Ohio. And if there's any questions, I'll take them now. Well, not hearing any, I am going to pass this on to Carla Ocker, who's going to get into a little more detail about these grants and particularly what you should expect to see in in FY25.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Carla Ocker. I'm with US EPA, as Amy said, and I'm a project manager / project officer. If you're in the state of Ohio and you are awarded a grant, there's a reasonably good chance that I would be the one who would manage your grant for you. I'm kind of like the primary contact for Ohio. My presentation today is going to be somewhat of a hodgepodge because I want to go over, first off, the grant schedule. When are we going to offer the grants? When are they awarded? Some funding trends and success rates so that you can take that information and think about, what kind of a grant you might like to apply for. I'm going to touch on why you should apply this year or next year. And some things to consider as you're applying for these grants and choosing whether you want your own grant or want to tap into Ohio EPA's targeted brownfields assessments. And then there's only a couple of grant changes. So I'll touch on those and then just a few reminders. Next slide. First off, our FY25 grant schedule. The goal, our headquarters goal, is to get the funding opportunity notice out at the beginning of September. However, the way things usually go, it's going to probably be more like mid to late September. So sometime in September, start keeping your eyes peeled. The proposals will be due 60 days after the notice of the funding opportunity availability, likely November, mid to late November. The announcements will be made next May 2025, and your cooperative agreement / grant will start on October 1st. You can request pre-award costs, even though the grant project and budget period will start on October 1st. You can request pre-award costs, and those can be up to 90 days prior to the grant award. And the reason I say that is because our National Brownfields Conference is going to be in Chicago this year. And it's going to be August 5th through 8th at the McCormick Center. So if you apply for a grant this year, consider whether you want that grant, if awarded, to consider it in your budget to pay for this year's Brownfields, travel to this year's Brownfields Conference. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about funding trends. What are we funding? Are we putting more money into community-wide assessments, coalition, or cleanup grants? I'm going to just touch on those three because those are the ones that are most relevant to the most people. If you have questions about the Revolving Loan Fund, please, reach out to me and we can have some one-on-one conversations about that. If you look at the community-wide assessments, in FY23, which was the first year we had Brownfields Infrastructure Law funding available to us, we gave out 110 community-wide assessment grants. Then in FY24, we backed that down to 60 awards because we wanted to put more money into coalition assessment grants. And the reason for that is we want to reach out to low capacity communities. And with the coalition assessment grants, because you have one educated, experienced, I should say, not so much educated, experienced lead coalition member and 2 to 4 non-lead coalition members that are usually lower capacity, lower experience. We were trying to get more money out to those low capacity communities. Then last year, for this year, and you'll see on my next slide when I talk about the success rates for these grants, we had loads of community-wide assessment grants. So this year we are going to give out more community-wide assessment grants. We're still going to focus on coalition assessment grants, but we're going to give out there's going to be a lower amount for the grant. So as you can see, this year we've got to focus on community-wide assessment grants. Then if you look at the coalition assessment grants, every year we have increased the number of grants and the amount of overall money, the overall pot for our coalition assessment grants. For FY25, we're going to keep that pot a little bit closer to the same as FY24, but we're going to just lower the ceiling amount, the maximum grant award, but give out a couple more coalition assessment grants. And I'll talk a little bit later about the coalition assessment grants because we've made some changes in eligible entities for eligible non-lead entities for those. Cleanup grants, I just included the last 2 years, FY24 and FY25, which is the grant period coming up now. You'll see we've given out a lot of cleanup money over the last 3 years. So we're lowering the amount, the highest grant award from $5 million to $4 million this year. And we're giving out some fewer grants, fewer cleanup grants. Next slide, please. So let's talk about success rates so you can kind of get a feel for why we've made some of the decisions that we made for FY25 and also get a feel for, really use this information to kind of decide whether a community-wide assessment grant is better for you or a coalition assessment grant is better for you. If you can see for FY24, that was last year, we had a lot of community-wide assessment applications, 95 applications, but only 35 awards. So there was about a 37% success rate for new applicants. The new applicants are people who've either never had an assessment grant from US EPA or who have had one, but that grant closed 8 years ago or before. So this year, let's see, 24 minus. So FY15 or before, if your grant closed FY15 or before, you would be considered a new applicant. Existing applicants, we got 100 applications, 25 awards. That's 25%. So if you look at that, we had almost 200 applications, and the success rate for community-wide assessments was, say, let's call it 32%. However, the coalition assessment grants, we only gave out 29 awards, but we had fewer applications, so the success rate was higher for our applicants. I anticipate it being similar this year, depending on how many coalition assessment grant applications we get, because, as I said earlier, we're increasing the amount of funding we're putting towards coalition assessment grants. Cleanup grants, you can see, as I mentioned before, we've given out a lot of cleanup money over the last few years. This year, we're knocking it down a little bit. We're not going to give out quite as much money in cleanup, but still, we're giving out a lot of money. And so I would expect the cleanup grants to still be a pretty high, that you'd still have a pretty high chance of success applying for a cleanup grant. So I encourage you to do that. Next slide, please. So here's the thing. Why apply now? The time is right for you to apply for our US EPA grants because FY25 and FY26, so this year and next year, are the last 2 years that we have Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding. After FY26, we will go back to just our regular appropriations. And our money will be cut. Our grant money that's available will be cut by about 2/3. Our regular appropriation funding is about $90 million that we can put towards grants. Those are for all the grant types, all the 104K grant types: assessment, cleanup, revolving loan fund, multipurpose, and job training grants. A couple of things to think about. With the infrastructure law money, our assessments, you can spend as much money as you want on assessing a site. Once we go back to our regular appropriations, assessment sites will be limited to $200,000 per site. Even if you get a $500,000 grant, you can only spend up to $200,000 on a single site. And this is even more important. The cleanup grants are going to be cut back to $500,000 per site. That's a statutory limit. We use the bill funding in the last 3 years. In the next 2 years, we've been using our bill funding to fund our cleanup grants. The infrastructure law, the bill law, does not have a limit on how much we can, well, it does. It's a $5 million limit on how much we can award per site, or you can spend per site for cleanups. Another really important item to think about is the cost share or return for cleanup, multi-purpose, and revolving loan funds. During this 5-year period that we're using the infrastructure law money, we've been funding our cleanup, multi-purpose, and revolving loan fund grants with most of them with bill money, and there's no cleanup or no cost share required. The cost share will go back to 20%. Next slide, please. Okay, a few other things to consider if you're thinking about applying for a US EPA grant. Just remember, a portion of the $1.5 billion that was awarded to EPA for the Brownfields program has been set aside, and it was set aside in the statute, for the Office of Inspector General. If you get a grant and it's funded with infrastructure law money, there's a much higher chance that you're going to be audited than if you're funded using regular appropriations. So, think about the audits. Make sure that you've got the capacity and you've got the know-how to manage your federal grant and to meet all the reporting requirements and the procurement requirements and that sort of thing. And if you're not sure you have the expertise or the capacity to comply with these grant management requirements, you do have other options. And if you have questions, you can give me a call. You can talk to TAB. They're well aware of all these funding options, and you can talk to Ohio EPA. Some of the things that you've got available to you, if you don't feel like you have the capacity, is using Ohio EPA's Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program. Amy talked about the Ohio EPA's what we call CWAG Street, Community-Wide Assessment Grants for States and Tribes. Ohio EPA, in addition to their normal funding for their Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program, had $2 million extra. And my understanding is, and I'm hoping they're going to come back in for another $2 million coming up this grant period. So they've got plenty of Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program money. You can also consider a coalition assessment grant. Partner with with another entity that you work well with. Make sure you can get along with these people and have them be the grant, the lead coalition member, because then they will have to be the one that will take care of all the paperwork. And for cleanup grants, also keep in mind, if you have a site that you want to clean up, one of the requirements is that you have to own the cleanup grant, or the property that's being cleaned up. You have to own it during the period that the cleanup is happening, that's being paid for by the grant. But it's okay to transfer that cleanup property to another higher capacity entity or more experienced entity for the cleanup grant. They apply for the grant, and then they can transfer the property back to you. Just make sure that you do your all appropriate inquiry before you transfer that property, so that that new entity isn't considered a potentially responsible party and made ineligible for our cleanup grants. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about coalition grants versus community-wide assessment grants, and talked a little bit about how we're really kind of pushing or highly funding the coalition assessment grants, but you don't really know which one's best for you. And here are some things to consider if you're debating whether you want a coalition or a community-wide assessment grant. So there's pros and cons. Community-wide assessment grant, you don't have to share the money. You've got total control of that money. You have to identify a target area. You spend your money mostly in that target area, but you can spend it and do assessments outside that target area. A lot more grants are awarded for community-wide assessment grants. Next year, we're going to even up the ante even more. The plan is to award 92 community-wide assessment grants versus 60 that we awarded last year. The success rate, though, is a little bit less, like we talked about, is a little bit lower for community-wide than for coalition assessment grants. But that's just by virtue of the fact that we get more community-wide assessment grants. So the competition's a little bit stiffer. Another con is you have to manage the grant reporting, like I talked about before. You have to, comply with federal procurement regulations when you hire your consultants, and you need to keep your records, and you're the one who's going to get it audited. Coalition assessment grant, one of the pros of that is you don't have to manage the paperwork part of it, but you do have to work with coalition members, and you have to share the funding. So choose your coalition members wisely. Make sure you work with entities that you've worked with in the past or that you know that you can get along with. There's fewer grants awarded. The success rate is higher, and I higher than with the community-wide, and I kind of expect that to be the case this year as well. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about a few changes. We don't have very many changes in the grants this year, but one big change is for the coalition assessment grants in FY25. We have a new threshold criteria, and it's actually much better. I think this is a really valuable change that we've made. At least one non-lead coalition member must have never received a US EPA Multipurpose Assessment Revolving Loan Fund or cleanup grant. So what that's saying is one of your non-lead coalition members must be a new grantee, an inexperienced grantee, a low capacity grantee. You want to be able to talk about that in your application, because like I said, we are really, one of the priorities of the infrastructure law is to reach out to low capacity and small and rural communities. Also, another thing that's different is if last year you had the non-lead coalition members were not allowed to have ever they had to be considered a new grantee. They had to have either never received an assessment grant or any kind of a grant, multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan, or cleanup from US EPA, or if they had received a grant, it had to have closed 8 years ago or more. This year, the non-lead coalition members are allowed to have received MARC grants in the past, and they can even have an open MARC grant right now, but they have to have shown that they've drawn down and dispersed at least 70% of that funding for each of their grants. So say somebody has a non-lead member, coalition member has an assessment grant and has a cleanup grant. It's not good enough that their assessment grant money has been drawn down to at least 70% has been drawn down and dispersed. That cleanup grant money has to have been drawn down and dispersed as well. Next slide, please. One other change. Oh, go ahead. Do we have a question?
I'm sorry, Carla, if we could go back to the other slide on the coalition grant. So at least one non-lead coalition member must never have received one. But
correct.
How about the ones that have? And are you still looking for disadvantaged communities, low capacity with those?
Yes, but they don't, that's not a threshold requirement for them to be low capacity. And well, they have to be kind of show that they're low capacity, but they don't necessarily have to be disadvantaged. Your grant application is going to be more competitive if they are disadvantaged, and you can say how they're low capacity and disadvantaged, but it's not a requirement.
Okay.
Read the guidelines carefully on that, though.
And how about the community-based organizations? Is that?
There's no longer a requirement that you have to include a community-based organization as one of your coalition, non-lead coalition members. However, it's still encouraged. And the reason for that is the community, we hope that by including a community-based organization, that there will be more community outreach and more grassroots involvement.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, one other change this year is in the cleanup grant threshold. We're going to offer a new cleanup grant threshold option. This option really has always been available, but it's not been explicitly stated in our grant guidelines. And the new option is going to be, think about your asbestos-only cleanups, your asbestos and lead-based paint and maybe universal waste cleanups. For those cleanups, if there's not been a release to the environment, it's always been that CERCLA 107 liability doesn't apply, because to be considered a potentially responsible party under CERCLA, that waste that's in the building has to have been released to the outside environment. If it's still in the building, CERCLA doesn't apply. Just flat out indoor contamination that's not been released and does not pose a threat to human health and the environment outside the building is not a CERCLA waste. It just doesn't apply. So this year, to make things a little more clear, we're saying that, and I included all the verbiage here so that you can have this to refer back to. But the key issues are, if you've got a site where all the hazardous waste is in building materials, that includes like PCBs and ballasts and that kind of thing, light ballasts, and your normal asbestos and lead-based paint. If all the waste is hazardous building material and that hazardous substance has not been released to the environment, then to the outdoor environment outside the building, then CERCLA 107 does not apply. And you don't have to argue that CERCLA doesn't apply. You can just essentially check the box. It's not going to be quite that simple, but that criteria is explicitly going to be included in our grant applications. So if you have questions on that, need some further clarification, I suggest you reach out to me. It's a little bit different than we've done in the past. So this is something a little bit new for what I consider asbestos-only cleanups. Next slide, please.
Carla, this
go ahead.
is Beth again. Could you
Sure.
at least provide an example of this, just to expand a little bit more?
Sure. If you've got a building, say for instance, you've got an old industrial building and it's gone through RCRA closure. So it's no longer a RCRA facility, it's cleaned up, but RCRA closure does not address asbestos for piping, asbestos, friable asbestos in tiles and window caulk and that sort of thing. So if you've got a building that only has asbestos and potentially lead-based paint in it, and the building is still secure, their samples have been taken outside of the building that shows that this asbestos and lead-based paint has not been exposed or has not left the building and is not in the soils outside the building, that sort of situation would be the perfect one for this exemption. CERCLA 107 does not apply to that kind of a scenario. So
would demolition be eligible?
No.
Okay.
Demolition is not an eligible cost under brownfields, unless the building has collapsed and you can't get to that asbestos to do the cleanup. In that case, say for instance, you've got a building and the building roof has collapsed and you can't get in there to remediate the asbestos before demolition, you can make a case that demolition is required to be able, as part of the cleanup.
Okay.
However, you need to make sure if you're in a situation like that, that's going to be one of those gray areas. You got to make sure that you've got documentation that asbestos that's in that collapsed building has not been released to the outside environment. So I would highly suggest that you, in your phase 2, do some sampling around the building and around where the collapse has occurred, but outside the building, so that you can make the case that this asbestos has not been released to the environment.
Okay, thank you.
But in general, I mean, it is a hard and fast rule that demolition is not an eligible cost for brownfields. Unless, like I said, unless it's needed to be able to get to the contamination. And you can't get to the contamination any other way. Say, for instance, you've got TCE underneath a building. That doesn't mean you necessarily can go in and demo the building and pull up the slab to get to that TCE contamination. If you've got other options that are actually more viable and more cost effective, like in situ remediation, groundwater treatment, that kind of thing, that needs to be considered first. Next slide. Okay, some things just to keep in mind. Our priorities for, especially for the infrastructure law bill, they just enhanced those priorities or reiterated them and brought them even more to the forefront, is community engagement. We want the community to be involved. Environmental justice. We want to reach out to environmental justice communities. Climate resilience. This administration is huge on climate change and climate resilience. And we are trying to reach out to low capacity communities. As you're writing your grant, keep those priorities in mind and make sure that you address them as you're addressing each of the grant criterion. Next slide, please. Procurement. I wanted to mention this. This is another one of those reminders. We are very, very much looking at procurement regulations and making sure that our grantees comply with 2 CFR parts 200 and 1500. You can have a consultant help you write your grant application. But once you get that grant, keep in mind that consultant cannot help you write your request for proposals for consultants and then bid on it. They can help you write it, but if they help you write that request for proposals after you get your grant, request for proposals for environmental consultants, they are precluded from bidding on that request for proposals. Another thing, when you write your request for proposal, when once you get a grant, keep in mind that you can't limit that. You can't include language in that request for proposals that limits the competition. And we go so far as saying you cannot, in your request for proposals, you cannot say, I will only accept proposals from companies who have managed US EPA Brownfields grants. That's a no-no. You can say, I won't, you demonstrate to me how your experience with brownfields cleanups, your experience with federal grants, but you cannot preclude companies who have not managed a US EPA or worked on a site or worked with a community that has a US EPA grant. You have to include price as one of your selection factors. You don't necessarily have to pick the lowest bid, but you need to pick the lowest and best bid. And we suggest that price be up 25%, be weighted as 25% of the selection criteria. Next slide, please.
Carla,
And then these are just, yes.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but we do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
The question is, what site activities from building a renewable or energy project on a brownfields land could qualify for cleanup funding? And she gives these examples: permanent installation of equipment purchased by the contractor or the recipient, site restoration activities such as grading that prepare a site for reuse, and similar activities that improve the real property.
Of the things that were mentioned there, as standalone items are not eligible. First off, the site has to be a brownfield. So say you're redeveloping a site that you're putting solar on a site that is a former landfill, or a place where there used to be a factory, that kind of thing, and which is common because of the fact that those factories have the infrastructure to distribute the electricity that's created by the solar. You could clean the site up with our funding. You could potentially, like, say for instance, you need a cap on that site to stop the direct contact pathway, to interrupt that direct contact pathway to contaminated soils. You could put a 2-foot cap on that site, or asphalt or something like that, and that can be considered part of the remediation. However, you cannot use our cleanup grants for installation of the solar. You cannot use it for restoration of the property unless that restoration is part of a cleanup. So for instance, counts as a cap, as an engineering control to stop like that direct contact path.
Okay. And then
Any other questions?
yeah, we have another one. Can you elaborate on the price as a selection factor part of the last slide? If we do a request for qualifications, can we have essentially a 2-step process? One, shortlist those contractors that meet the qualification, and then examine the cost bid for that shortlist.
Yeah, you can do that. You just have to consider, if somebody doesn't meet the qualifications that you need, for instance, doesn't have experience assessing brownfields, and you're trying to get someone to be your consultant for an assessment grant, if they don't have that experience, then yeah, they can be disqualified. Your process, we don't dictate what your process is. You just have to make sure that your process includes price. And, once again, I said you have to choose the lowest and best contractor. So if they don't have experience, then they're not going to be the best contractor. Now, whether you do that as a 2-tiered process or a 1-tiered process, that's really up to you. And we have guidance. It's called Best Practices Guide for Federal Procurement for Brownfields Grants. We have a guidance document that can help you through that. I hope that answers your question, but without getting too deep into the process, I'm not sure I can answer it any better.
That document is also one of the resources that's available on the website for those who register. That's one of the attached resources.
Okay, I think I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to just go through the next slide. I only have a couple slides left, so we'll go through those a little more quickly. Oh, construction. This is the last meaty slide that I have. It's just a reminder that because we didn't used to use the construction budget line item, it's just a reminder that if your costs are going to be more than 50% of the costs that are in your budget are going to be for remediation, that needs to be put on a separate budget line item called construction. And if you're not sure, you're not going to put it under contractual. You would put that under construction. And then there's another budget line item called the other budget line item. So if you're not sure whether 50% of your grant's going to be spent on straight remediation, then you can put that in the other budget line item. And I have here a link to our FAQs. Those FAQs are frequently asked questions, and the most recent ones that are available on that website are for FY24. The FY25 FAQs should be out within the next month. Next slide, and I think that's my closing slide. Oh, and this is just a just kind of an FYI for your reference kind of thing. These are the grants that we're offering this year, the amounts and how they're being funded, whether they're bill funding versus regular appropriations. Next slide, please. And I have two other references here for you that outline if you're applying for an assessment grant, what other grants are you allowed to apply for? You can just take a look at those, download the slides. And the next slide, please, is the first slide was for people who don't have any brownfields grants right now. And this slide is for people who have open grants with US EPA. These charts will be available on the webpage, the FAQ webpage link, and I'm 99% sure they're going to actually be in the proposal guidelines as well. So they'll be available to you. I just wanted to make sure you knew that these were available. Next slide. And I'm done. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. That was great. As always, Carla.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, we'll start the panel presentation. And there may be panel members that jump in and give comments as we go on. Carla is one of those panel members, as is Dan and Roxanne, Sally, and I believe there's some others. I'm sorry, I don't have those notes in front of me, but we'll just go forward here. Next slide, please. So we talked about this yesterday. You really have to know what the scope of your brownfield problem is. And if you have multiple eligible sites or just one. If you have just one, you might really consider giving Dan a call, finding out about the Ohio EPA program. You have to know where your target area is. You really should think on this now. What work is needed? Do you need to plan? Do you need to assess, clean up? Next slide, please. And here are some reasons to consider an EPA grant. You have that good land use plan, or you have a plan that everyone, all the residents or stakeholders have had their fingerprints all over. There's a lot of community engagement with it. The target area, do you work with community-based partners? And this can be the neighborhood organizations, churches, schools, nonprofits, universities in the brownfields impacted area. Do lack of funds affect the quality of life? Does the timing of the grant work for the needs of the community? So you submit the grant now, let's say in November, awards will be in May typically, and then October 1st, your grant funds will be available to you. So you have to think about the timing. Do you have experience working with the Ohio EPA? Have you participated in their programs? That definitely demonstrates some experience in brownfields redevelopment, even though you didn't have to do the procurement. It's good experience for you. So if you haven't, that might be your first step with your sites. But if not, we can work through that too. Next slide, please. And here, this is the same slide I showed yesterday. The current guidelines aren't available. Review last year's, that's important. All the funding year 2024 grant applications are posted at the link below until August 31st. So you can take a look at all the successful and unsuccessful applications here, or go to ksutab.org, select Tab Easy, and walk through the grant. And we'll talk about Tab Easy tomorrow. Next slide, please. Don't forget grants.gov. That's the only way you really can submit your grant. I'm sure there might be some ways around that, but I think most of the time grants.gov is the way that you submit your grant to the EPA. We do have Brownfields grants.gov tips as a resource. take a look. It's very helpful and user-friendly. Next slide, please. So before the pen hits the paper, start with a great project rather than a great grant. We talked about this yesterday, but if you weren't in the webinar yesterday, if you have questions, contact EPA Region 5. Do that now before the guidelines come out. Once the guidelines do come out, you can only really contact EPA Region 5 about eligibility issues, eligibility of a site. So that's the rule there. Anytime you can actually reach out to TAB, KSU TAB, and we do quite a bit of review of grant applications and assist with that. So we really are up on the guidelines and what's going on. And then we do, if we don't have the answer, we figure out a way to get an answer for you. Next slide, please. And so today we're talking about the narrative ranking criteria. There's other components of the grant application package, but today we're just focusing on narrative ranking. We will start today with just project area description and the community need and community engagement. Tomorrow we'll be doing task descriptions and programmatic capability. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think that Carla gave kind of a really good recap of what was going on last year. Here is what I pulled together for this year, and I actually got it from the EPA website. Gives you an idea of total per grant type. It might be helpful for you. Next slide, please. Each grant has individual EPA ranking criteria. As you can see, it's pretty much evenly done, except I do notice that trend for task description, cost estimates. Those are given their fair share of points. So that's an area that you really want to pay attention to, as well as everything else. But don't just think it's an exercise of putting numbers down on paper. Next slide, please. EPA grants fun facts. Ownership of property isn't necessary if you're going for a community-wide assessment grant. However, site access is. And having site access and saying that you have site access in your assessment grant is a good thing. So, I mean, it really shows that you're really on your way. You've got control of the property. You can do quite a bit. One site-specific property, I don't know if this is really correct. Carla, if you're there, can you tell me if someone can just do one site-specific property with a community-wide assessment grant?
Yes, you can.
Okay, and can it be for the full amount?
It can.
Okay.
It can. And back in the days when we used to have separate community-wide, site-specific and community-wide assessment grants,
Yes.
I would always encourage people to apply for the community-wide assessment grant in case you had money left over.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Assessment coalitions, I think we've talked about that. Cleanup grants, eligible entity must own the site at the time of the application. You need a phase 2. You need that draft APCA. Public notification, pay attention to public notification. It makes me sad when I see that a grant was submitted, but they didn't meet threshold. If eligibility of a site to undergo cleanup is in question, reach out to Region 5 for guidance now. Don't wait. Just reach out now. Next slide, please. So this is just, for me, a very simplistic way of outlining a geographic boundary, which you will in your application. talk about a geographic boundary. This is where the work can be performed, formally referred to as jurisdiction. It can be the city boundaries, it can be a corridor. It's whatever you want that boundary to be, as long as it's in your jurisdiction. And then within that boundary, discuss what brownfield challenges and impacts in that area. What I found a lot with grant reviews last year was that people were talking about the challenges and impacts to the target area. But what they're really looking for here initially is the geographic area. And then how will this grant address these challenges and impacts? That you really have to put that into your application. So if you see here, the geographic boundary, I've made it a white square because I'm not really technically savvy. So within that geographic boundary, I had a target area. And that's where you really are going to focus your grant activities. And if that's in your work plan, remember, you really are committed to working in that target area unless you're unable to get site access or other things are going on. But within that target area, then, you will have priority sites, and that's what the yellow arrow is pointing to, is a building that was a priority site. So first geographic boundary, then inside of that, your target area, and then your priority sites. Each of the grants discussed today can have more than one target area. So next slide, please. Description of the target area. Again, really important. Quantify all the possible brownfields in the description. The number of acres, the number of properties. You can include properties like the vacant lots, the blighted or aging buildings. Where are the brownfields with respect to the neighboring properties? What's going on in that area? Do you see a lot of high crime, unsafe property? Or do you have sites that are adjacent to environmentally sensitive areas? Describe your locations, where they're proximal to, then check out your EJ indexes, your CGES tool. I'm going to touch on that just very shortly, but we have Riley speaking from EPA Region 5. Riley will be speaking about these tools in more detail tomorrow. Are the brownfield challenges and impacts described in your geographic boundary magnified in the target area? It's good to bring it up. With cleanup grants, describe the properties targeted for cleanup with clear information on known contamination and site conditions. Detail, detail, detail. Next slide, please. And quantitative data is only as good as the qualitative data description of what it means. So in the first paragraph here, I am referencing, it's great. They use the CGES tool and the CDC agency for their data, and they generally talk about it. But it needs to explain the data. So in the second paragraph, you have the target area, where it's located, percentage of residents that are low income. And not only do they bring up the data, they do compare and contrast with the unemployment rate. That's an important piece too. You can throw the number out there, but what difference does it make unless you contrast it to something else? Next slide, please. And these are the EJ screen data sets that Riley will speak to tomorrow. And we'll go to the next slide. These are so important for you as you collect data, as you're drafting your assessment grant or cleanup grant or coalition grant. There's 13 EJ indexes, and we all know environmental justice is near and dear to EPA's heart. So use this information. Next slide, please. And What I've done many times is you have census data where you have a census tract is so large. You know, it may encompass several towns or cities. Especially in the rural areas, a lot of times what I do is I try to drill down then to the census block group, which you can do on the EJ screen. Next slide, please. Then CJust. This is from White House for Justice 40 initiative. Very important. Helps identify those disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. If you're in an area that's so rural that you can't get that information from CJust, you really need to find data that you can justify to EPA from a source that's reputable, or income surveys, that types of things in the areas. Next slide, please. Description of priority brownfield sites. So what you want to do is highlight one or more priority sites. Why is the site a priority? I see these beautiful descriptions, but no reason why the site is a priority. With coalitions, you have to have at least one priority site in the lead and non-leads target area. Think about the potential contaminant impacts, not just the contaminants. What are the impacts? Clean up, describe the contamination, use your phase 2 for that information, that source. Removed, the structures, are they removed or reused? Exposure, how do existing contaminants impact surrounding residents? Next slide, please. So what might be missing in this example? And it's a good example. And basically, I think what I noticed about this was, for one, it's a foundry site, but there's no description of any buildings, no description of the site conditions necessarily. Also, what is it impacting? You know, they give great ideas on what could be there, but how does that impact the surrounding residents or environment? Next slide, please. Plan to identify additional sites, if grant funds remain. This is important. Don't forget this piece, and make sure it's a good time anyway to understand what your prioritization criteria is. This is something, of course, EPA Region 5 could help you with, but TAB can assist you with too. So this is in the event that your grant funds are exhausted after addressing the TA. You use that criteria to identify additional sites. And this criteria does not apply to cleanup. Next slide, please. So revitalization of the target area. Got some bullets here on what you should do, but do the reuse strategies align with environmental justice, climate action, community resilience? That's important. How does it align with your land use and revitalization plans? Identify the plan. Describe the community's involvement with the plan. With cleanup, the extent to which the reuse is an appropriate reuse in a federally designated floodplain, if that's the case. Next slide, please. So this is just sort of an overview of setting the stage in the target area. The greater the scarcity of housing, the more this competition drives rents up. There's what they call the missing middle, as households with entry-level professional occupations, blue-collar workforce, are squeezed by decreasing affordability in the area. So with that, you set the stage in the target area, which leads to then the master plan focused on the Overton area. And so it explains what came out of that during the community engagement events And then major elements of each plan involve residential options, including single-family townhomes and two-story townhomes. So add your reuse plans or community ideas and tie it all to revitalization of the target area. Next slide, please. So what can be better here? Well, let's see. They talk about a proposed reuse. They talk about a housing study commissioned by the city. What I don't see is how it relates to environmental justice, climate adaptation. Oh, there was one other, and I can't even remember it now. I'm so sorry, but there was another factor there. You need to tie that in. There's probably other gaps here. So just an example. Next slide, please. Revitalization of the target area. Focus on outcomes and benefits that will take place in the target area and benefits the underserved populations, as well as the community at large. So these are just some thoughts upon cleanup, how the proposed project revitalization will stimulate potential economic development or facilitate nonprofit purposes. How will the proposed project improve local climate adaptation mitigation capacity? How will it protect residents and community investments? Will the reuse facilitate renewable energy from wind, solar, or geothermal energy or other energy efficiency? And I always think of this when they're doing even rehab of a building or new construction, particularly for residential, that what you're doing there is that new construction, you'll have more efficient appliances. You'll have lower maybe heating bills or water bills for the residents. So there's lots of ways to kind of think through how are you doing this and quantify what are the benefits from the updated infrastructure. But quantify as much as you can. Lowering crime would be a great way to discuss updated infrastructure with safer lighting and walkways. Quantify energy cost benefits as much as you can. Next slide, please. Strategy for leveraging resources. Describe your eligibility for monetary funding, but don't make it a laundry list of everything you could possibly ever apply for. Make it mean something. If you are eligible for certain grants, how are they going to get you to the end game? How are they going to get you through to redevelopment? And the extent to which these key funding resources, not only completion of assessment remediation, but also what is it going to mean in terms of even infrastructure? What is it that you need to complete the project? And here are some pretty common examples in the other bubble here. And then for cleanup resources for site characterization, do you have that funding if you require additional characterization in your cleanup grant? And Carla, I hope you're still there, but characterization isn't normally paid for through the cleanup grant, correct?
No, you're right. Characterization is not. Confirmation sampling is. And you can also do, like say, for instance, you need to take a few samples to refine your volumes or the concentrations of the waste that'll be disposed of. You can do that, especially waste characterization, like just for waste profiles, say for a landfill, that kind of thing, but not full-blown phase 2 characterization.
Okay, and I do have a question about, can you define site characterization? What do we mean by that?
You want me to address that, Beth?
I'd love it.
All right. Well, site characterization would be your phase 2 assessment to determine, the kinds of waste or the kinds of contaminants that are there, the volumes of contaminants that are there, as opposed to, you're defining your extent of contamination and concentration so that you can inform a remedial action plan or APCA. We have analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives. Does that answer the question?
It sure did. And I always think of someone gives you a phase 2, a limited phase 2, where they poked a few holes in the ground and they say, this is the concentration in the soil, this is concentration in the groundwater. But they don't go into more details like what's the extent of that contamination? Is that groundwater going off site? Do you have that information? To me, that has a lot to do with site characterization as well.
Yes, it does. I mean, you have to define what's there, like I said, to the point where you can develop a remedial action plan and know the most cost, be able to evaluate the most cost-effective way to address the contamination. And that is one of the reasons why we've brought the states into this process of defining site characterization. You have to submit to the state your site characterization documents, your phase 1s, your phase 2s, and in your APCA. And the state has to write a letter to say that the site's been characterized well enough to be able to develop a cost estimate and a remedial action plan.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So speaking of laundry lists, this is a laundry list of strategies for leveraging resources in Ohio, but make sure they're applicable to your project and whether or not you are eligible to apply for these types of resources. Next slide, please. Cleanup grant strategy for leveraging resources. That site characterization piece we just brought up. How are you going to take care of that? Make sure you understand the likelihood and type of characterization needed. Your local commitments from partners should be firm with an associated value. Ask for their letter of commitment. Resources needed for site reuse, secured, sought, or being sought. What's the likelihood that you could receive those resources? Consider all your activities, including demolition and construction. Next slide, please. And strategy for leveraging resources, the use of existing infrastructure. I worked for a city for 9 years, and it seems like any redevelopment needed additional infrastructure. There was probably, the infrastructure was there, but did they have the high-speed internet needed? That type of thing. And then you always have that the stormwater planning, factor that in. And what are the leverage benefits of using existing infrastructure? Think about that. What's the benefit of reusing a building versus constructing a new building? Well, for one, the cost, but for another, to the environment. So think about those leverage benefits. List what infrastructure need or upgrades will be required to meet the project goal. It's okay if you don't have that right now, but you should have a plan for how you will get it. Next slide, please. Oh, and thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to pass it to Amy Yursevich.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to speak on Section 2 of the grant narrative. which is community need and community engagement. Next slide. Community need. So what you're going to focus on there is why does the community need the funding? Why are they in a situation where they cannot afford to conduct assessments or conduct cleanup and pay for it through the city coffers or the community coffers? So you want to focus on things like, do you have reduced tax revenues? Are income tax revenues down because a large industry left? That's also going to probably drive your project as far as redevelopment and target areas and priority brownfields. But if a large employer or employers have left recently, and you have an increased percentage or increased number of unemployed in your community and your target areas, you're going to have reduced tax revenues. So talk about that. If you have a small population or low income community, those are really important to talk about. In fact, if you don't have one of those, as you can see in my important note in white down there, you're going to receive only about 2 points of the 5 maximum points that you can receive for this particular subsection. Impoverished tax base, that would be a result of people leaving. If you can talk about population changes that have happened over time, either due from anything for loss of business to COVID, please discuss that. Are your limited resources, is your limited tax base prioritized elsewhere? An example would be you have to expand your wastewater treatment plant this year or repair it, modernize it, leaving no extra funds for brownfield assessment. And here's some good example language that we've seen in a successful grant where we talk about their annual budget is primarily financed through property taxes. Their population is low, so they're touching on that small population, and the median values of the owner-occupied housing are lower than the state value by quite a bit. And the target area is in the 90 to 95th percentile for housing burden. So about housing burden means a larger percentage, typically 30% of individuals' income is going to rent and utilities or mortgage and utilities. So they're not seeing as much property tax, probably not seeing as much income tax if their population went down. And this was a really good one, I thought. They had an emergency. April 2023, the city's networks experienced a targeted cyber attack, forcing a complete isolation of the city's technology system, which cost the city an estimated $2 million. So this is, a huge, hit to their budget. And because of that, they're not going to be in any kind of financial situation to, say, pay for a cleanup of a site or assessment of a number of sites. Next slide. So community need, threats to sensitive population. Beth mentioned the use of EJ Screen. It provides you a lot of information about how the population is, a sensitive population is being affected either health-wise or suspected health-wise by being close to things like Superfund sites or hazardous waste sites. It will also give you health disparities, as it's indicated in this picture, for things like low life expectancy or heart disease, asthma, cancer, things that US EPA is going to want to see in these grants when they're talking about health effects. So you want to use this, as Beth mentioned, it breaks down into census block groups instead of large tracts. So you can really drill down into the data and look at your target areas and where their problems are. In addition, applicants are encouraged to use CGEST, and I have the link to both CGEST and EJ Screen here. You want to be able to talk about whether any of your priority sites or even your target areas are listed within a disadvantaged census tract. Next slide. For the 3 categories of sensitive population or populations where we talk about the problems that they might have, whether it's health or whether it's environmental justice issues, do not forget to describe how your grant will address or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to sensitive populations. Quite often I will see a really good description of adverse health effects or EJ, but then then the applicant does not talk about how this particular grant project, what you're focusing on, and how identifying contaminants in the area or cleaning them up in the case of a cleanup grant are going to, help this. And I just provide some example language down there in the bottom in white. So you want to say things like this grant will facilitate reduction of environmental contamination that may be associated with the target area's chronic disease rates and help lessen its significantly high health burdens. This is actually from a grant that did win, or a application that did win a grant. Next slide. So we're going to talk at, you've identified your sensitive populations. So and that is elderly, children, single family households, pregnant women. And now you want to take a look at the health or welfare of these sensitive populations. So how will the grant address these issues? And some example language that we've seen in grants are abandoned and or unaddressed brownfield sites in the target areas, promote environmental degradation, and contribute to the negative public health impacts for nearby residents, particularly the sensitive populations in these areas. These populations are acknowledged to experience greater health risks and in the brownfield target areas, and they can include infants, children, elderly, minorities, pregnant mothers, and individuals with a history of chronic illness. These are all sensitive populations, but they're not really, they're very general statements. They're not talking about the percentage of children or elderly and comparing it, as Beth mentioned. You need to compare and contrast so that you know that what is the problem in this area? Does it have a higher percentage of pregnant women or children, and compared to the US and state values or city values? And you're talking about the general population. Compared to the general population, it's greater. That doesn't really mean anything. That's a very generic term. So you want to make sure that you're very specific and looking at either, a city, a county, the US, comparing and contrasting to known entities that people can relate to, and your reviewers can compare appropriately. And we don't talk about how the grant will address the threats to these populations, as I mentioned in my earlier slide. Next slide, please. Here's a better one, or a more improved language, where we talk about the percentage of families that live below the poverty line and compare it to the US. Minority population is compared to the US, and the elderly population is compared to the US, so that you know that it is higher, and in some cases significantly higher in this particular target area. Other issues that can cause problems and lack of employment, poverty is residents that attended high school that lack a diploma, a larger percentage there compared to statewide and national, and those that hold a college degree or higher compared to statewide and national. So these can also lead to problems in your target area with respect, as I said, to poverty or unemployment and other issues. And at the end, we talk about how this grant will facilitate redevelopment in the poorest area of the township and create living wage jobs in the light manufacturing business that is planned for the priority sites. Let's hope earlier in this grant, we talk about that light manufacturing business and how they want to bring it in and whether maybe they have an actual developer. That can be discussed in section 1 that Beth talked about. You don't want to say these things if you don't have them. Next slide. Community need. So if we're talking about sensitive populations or any of these 1, 2, and 3 areas where we're talking about sensitive populations, having a table can be very helpful. It can allow you to mention your target area, discuss your target area, and it's an easy way for reviewers to compare how that target area compares to maybe the state or the city, the US. You can discuss things, you can add discussion to this, but it's just an easy way to let them know what the data is very quickly. Next slide. So here's an example where for the greater than normal incidence of disease of adverse health conditions, you want to make sure that you're talking about the cancer mortality rate and or the asthma rate here, because that's something that is mentioned in the grant guidelines. And if you don't mention that, either of those or birth defects, you will only earn 2 out of your 5 points. This is huge because that's a 3-point difference, and that can make the difference between getting a grant or not getting a grant just in this area. So make sure that you're covering at least one of those. If you can cover all 3, all the better to make looking better. And again, using a table to show the differences between your state and your US values is helpful. Sometimes getting that cancer information in the target area or asthma or other diseases or other adverse health effects is difficult. Sometimes it's only reported by county. If you have to report it by county, compare it to the state and US values and mention that in your discussion of the narrative. Also, there are different data sources, such as hospitals often have in your area may have studies that are specific to your particular area because they need to make their own plans and workforce decisions and supply decisions based on that. So you can often find some of that information there. Next slide. Promoting environmental justice. As Beth mentioned, this is very important to EPA. And if you want to know a little bit about what environmental justice is and examples, these are things that can vary from inadequate access to healthy food. So food deserts, as you're probably familiar with, inadequate public transportation. We're talking about target areas that likely have high rates of poverty, low median income, probably don't have a car. So the importance of public transportation and getting an adequate access is very important in these areas. More pollution exposure. Oftentimes these areas are closer to, and you can find this information out through both EJ Screen and some other databases that we have in our resources. We have a list of different things so that you can see, hey, are we closer to a Superfund site or a hazardous waste site in these target areas where people that already have issues such as health issues and poverty issues. And for more explanation of impacts, the 2024 FY 2024 FAQs, which are on the EPA Brownfield Grant site. You can click here. They will cover, Section S will actually cover a lot of these different impacts and give you some good examples of what you want to focus on when you write this portion or subsection of the grant. Next slide, please. So some of the things you want to do are that the grant asks you, the grant application asks you to do, or describe your environmental justice issues and how they affect the underserved communities and disadvantaged census tracts in your target area. Discuss how this grant and reuse strategy will advance environmental justice and minimize things such as displacement of residents and businesses among the underserved communities in the target area. Now, again, we want to make sure, and I think Beth talked about this, that you identify through CGEST that your priority sites are listed in a disadvantaged census tract. Again, you may only be able to earn up to 2 points of 5 in this particular. There's 10 points in here for the 2 questions, but again, you could lose 3 points. And when you're talking about environmental justice, which is huge. And here's some good example language. They speak to EJ Screen tool and the percentiles of things such as lack of indoor plumbing, low income, heart disease, asthma, lead paint, which tends to be a huge issue oftentimes with older housing and unupdated rental housing in target areas, EJ areas, and they compare it to the state and to the US. And so 3 of the priority brownfield sites are located within a disadvantaged EJ tract. So they're talking about how they actually, for the first request, how they actually use the percentiles and talk about where the problems are in their target area, and that their target area is in a disadvantaged tract. Next slide.
Amy, could we pause for just a couple of questions that were posed in the chat?
Sure.
The first one is about EJ areas. And so the question was, is it good to address these EJ items in my application, even if my project will have no measurable impact on these items? The example is a food desert.
No, you don't have to mention all of those issues, whether it's a food issue, if it's not going to address the lack of transportation or food issue, but you want to make sure that the target area or areas that you do have EJ issues, that you're at least addressing some of these issues. You're going to really lose out on points if you can't really talk to how you might help. And things like creating jobs in this area, and maybe even updating, as Beth mentioned, things like lighted sidewalks with lighting, different things that are going to increase the safety, assessing sites that have pollution that might contribute to asthma. Those sorts of things, you want to speak to what you can improve there, not to actually every EJ issue.
Great, thanks, Amy. And I think the next question, if Carla, if you're available to answer this one, it was kind of going back to the community need and a concern that, maybe there's a small community bias where the community may not have their residents may be wealthier, have high tax-paying businesses, and would they be favored in the point system solely because they're small in population?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure I totally understand it, because you're kind of talking about 2 different things. if there's, if you've got are you talking about like if you've got a census tract, say that the number or the average income is skewed because you've got one or two rich people that live in the census tract and everybody else is very low income? Is that your question?
I think I'll see if there's a clarification. So it's a note that, they can give examples of small population communities whose biggest problem is building more drawers to fit all their money in. So it's not a matter of skewed data. It's more about they're small but very wealthy. And is it just because they're small, will they get more points?
No, absolutely not. No, you've got to meet all those other criterion as well. We're huge on disadvantaged communities. Small, rich communities just don't have the demographics to be able to be competitive in our grant process. They just don't have the ability to answer the questions fully and get full points.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that, Carla.
Sure. Thanks, Carla. I'm going to move on because I've only got about 4 more minutes. So I'm going to move on to community engagement. And you have a lot of partners in this grant project, anything from brownfield developers to church and neighborhood groups, to the Ohio EPA, to TAB, to workforce development partners. So keep in mind, what do you need? Who do you want as a partner? Who's going to help you with your issues, what you're trying to address with your grant project? Don't just pick any partners. You want to make sure that they're applicable and can help you with your grant project. Next slide. Here you have to, in your grant, you're going to indicate what partners you have, who their point of contact is, who's going to be representing them, and what they're going to provide to your grant project. In this case, they're going to assist with community outreach and cleanup reuse planning because they do have experience in this area, and also disseminating information to technical assistance residents. And one of the things, Beth talked about this, and I'm going to mention this again, you can lose points if you don't have community-based partners, often church groups, often just community groups, neighborhood groups. These are people that really have their ear to the ground and they're going to help you. It's not just finding a way for EPA to dock you points. You need to have these community groups. I looked at a grant not too long ago where they talked about, we're going to bring women-owned businesses to this partnership, or we're going to bring women-owned businesses and get their opinions, because this is really going to help with the retail we want to bring into one of our target areas. But then they don't mention any women-owned business groups or anything like that. So make sure that if you're focusing on these things, you're hitting things that are relevant to the project itself that you are going to do with as far as your grant. And for assessment groups, assessment coalition apps discuss how each non-lead coalition member will be engaged and informed. So you want to make sure that they're actually part of your group, and what their input is and how their input is being dealt with is appropriate for a partner and somebody that's part of a coalition. Next slide, please. I'm going to move on, but this is just one way. I know Beth has used this to talk about outlining your project, like starting right now. You don't want to wait till the last minute. And some of the things you're going to be looking at is who are your community-based organizations. And from that, you can also help develop who's going to be your best partners in the project. Next slide. Incorporating community input. So you have to have a plan for communicating your progress, communicating your project. And how will you keep them engaged? One of the problems can be, especially in small populations or rural areas, is getting people to come to the table. Make it easy, go out and get these people interested. You may have to knock on some doors, things like that, but make sure that you have a good plan, knowing your community, to get them there and keep them engaged. And you're also going to be asked, what are your means of communication? Make sure you have a lot of them, and that they'll take care of that population. Not everybody has a computer, particularly in poverty areas. So make sure that information's at the library, that radio stations maybe they listen to can put public service announcements, things like that on it. Maybe you distribute leaflets. There's maybe you go to events that they're having, a craft day or something like that, and be out there communicating this and when your meetings are going to be. So you want to make sure that you're really looking at how to engage this your population, your target area population, and your community population. Next slide. And incorporating input, you want to make sure that you don't miss incorporating input. I see this a lot, where you'll talk about your community engagement plan, and it's a great plan, but then you're focused on getting input, but you don't say how you're going to use it. And this is just some example language where they're not considering the input, or they haven't discussed it. Maybe they have every intention of doing it, but they don't discuss it in their grant application. Next slide. And this one does talk about that. If you look, all comments received, this is the last sentence, and site decisions will be discussed during the community meetings. They really hit on what their plan is, how they're going to interact with citizens and target area residents, and how they're going to solicit input and actually discuss it and give some thought to it and incorporate it. Next slide. Next slide. And we want to hear your feedback today as we move on to the group exercise. So please either click on this link or put this link in your put this link and pull it up on your web browser, or use your phone to scan this QR code. We'll only get better if we hear from you, and we'll only continue to provide things that you need if we hear from you. So don't forget to fill out our survey. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to get on to the grant writing workshop instructions. You each, whether you know it or not, have been assigned to a working group and will be put in a separate Zoom breakout room along with a facilitator. Don't worry about this. You just have to keep on this Zoom, and you'll suddenly show up in a working group, and somebody such as myself or Beth or Roxanne or Dan will be actually working with you as a facilitator and walking you through the exercise. One of the things that you will do is look at section 1 or 2, which Beth and I have gone over today. Tomorrow we'll focus on section 3, and you're going to be looking at a successful assessment grant from Barberton, Ohio. You'll have an hour, 40 minutes, a little less on day 2 to complete this exercise. Your facilitator will help you assign a lead, or they may have to actually select one, volunteer one, and who will report out. Review your narrative ranking criteria for sections 1 or 2 as appropriate. You're going to be comparing those to what is in the grant and giving your own scores for each of the subsections of section 1 or 2 of the grant. When you're reviewing, one of the things you really want to make sure is that you give time to how the reviewer ties their story together through each section. I know you're focusing on one section, but you want to make sure that they don't talk about a target area at the beginning of section 1, and then when they get to priority brownfield sites, they find a priority brownfield site that isn't in the target area. So you want to make sure that they're linking their story or coming up with their story at the beginning and carrying it through. Next slide. So you'll have Section 5 narrative review information. You'll have Section 4 of the guidelines. These are the last year's our FY24 guidelines that gives you the actual language that the grantee follows or the applicant follows when they're writing their grant. And as I mentioned, what you'll have last year's successful community-wide assessment grant for Barberton, Ohio. If you don't have these, probably your facilitator will pull them up, share their screen and pull them up so you can look through them. Next slide. And clear and concise writing. Don't use a lot of flowery language that really means nothing. The reviewers want specifics, and don't leave any criterion blank, any subsection blank, and don't put any new not applicable either. There's always a response for everything these days in these FY24 and I'm sure FY25 to come grants applications. And detail, make sure that they have enough detail to allow for an evaluation. I think Beth and I have talked about that. Did they leave out percentages and just write general information? Were there some good census values they could have pulled from, or EJ screen values? Keep that in mind. Did they provide a response to all the information? I already mentioned that. Make sure the applicant used sample format tables, or if they didn't, if there's a sample format table in the guidelines, make sure they included all the information in that table, even if they put it in more narrative form. And consistency, as I mentioned before, throughout the proposals is essential. Whatever they talked about at the beginning regarding their target area, their geographic area, the priority brownfields, and their problems should follow through the entire grant narrative. Next slide. Okay, we are ready to be broken into working groups. So I'll let Dana do her magic, and you'll find yourself in a group with a facilitator.
Okay, I hope everybody selected someone to report out for your group. We're going to be using the group scores. You can either use the slide from the facilitator guide, or whoever is going to be reporting out can just kind of go over that, but just let Dana know so she can make sure to unmute whoever it is. We're going to talk about if the community responded to the proposal the way that they needed to, if they got the amount of points and whatnot. So we should probably start with section 1. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just kind of wanted to go over this. Try not to spend more than 1 or 2 minutes on your area if you can. Who was, Beth, you were section 1, right?
Yes, I was.
You want your group?
Sure. We're gonna, and Aubrey Hodder, and introduce yourself as to where you're from, Aubrey, but she is going to give the summary.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Aubrey Howder. I'm an economic development planner at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. So our team works on Brownfield, and hi, Roxanne. We have benefited a lot from the work of KSU. So thanks for putting this on today. Our team gave wait, do you want us to do just our full points, like what we did for everything?
Yeah, you can break down what you did for each section. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
In total, we gave this application a 33 out of 40. For the first section of target area and brownfields, this was the one with the most points eligible. They got a 17 out of 20. And our feedback from the team was that we really wanted to see more data. There was a lot of comments about minorities would impact, or there's minority and kids in their targeted areas, but they didn't really explain how many there were. They didn't compare that data to like another location to give us context. And when they talked about impact, you know, they said things like they would benefit, but we weren't really sure how. So we wanted to see just more data, and we also had some comments about the formatting of this, thinking that tables may have been a little bit more helpful to glean the information that they were trying to convey. And lastly, we thought that they had too many priority sites. They had 9. We know that they focused on 2 of those specifically, but we still thought that 9 priority sites for 1 target area was a little much. But I think the biggest factor there was that we were kind of missing the people part of the application. For the next section, the revitalization of the target area, we gave them an 8 out of 10 for this section. Again, the similar feedback of wanting more data and more of a people focus. We wanted to see more information on how the community was involved in prioritizing these sites and whatnot. But we did like that they gave a good connection with the reuse strategy, connecting with their master plan. We saw some community engagement there. We just wanted more of it. In the last section, we gave this one an 8 out of 10. We thought that it was a little too general on the utilities, but we ended up giving them full points for that subsection. So the lost points was on the resources they had available for this. Financially, we thought that it felt like a laundry list of all potential brownfield programs available and not really a strategy for how they were going to go after, what was most plausible for them, which one was most likely that they would get. Did they already have access to any of these funds? Had they had prior experience with any of these grants? We wanted to see more meat on the bones of that section and not just a list of programs out there. So that was where they lost points there. Yeah, overall, I think the main point was that we wanted more data and more people, I think would summarize our feelings and why they got a 33 out of 40. Anything
Awesome.
else you'd like from me?
No, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to go and see how your group compared to that?
Yes, John West will be reporting out for our group.
There we go. Hey, I'm John West. I'm with Cox Colvin, and we're an environmental consultant up in Plain City, Ohio, northwest corner of Columbus. And we actually gave this first section a 32 out of 40, so just a little bit lower than the first group. I definitely appreciated the first group's comments about the resources needing to be a little bit more less laundry list and more substantial. I think that our overall feeling for a lot of the sections is that they were kind of using the spaghetti on the wall approach, throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. They hit all the bases for what the EPA's checklist is, but they weren't good about making it an overall thought. There was very little connection between certain things. There were areas where they would give priorities, but they wouldn't link it to the next thought in terms of how that's going to turn into clean energy or how that's going to turn into recreational use. And so, like I said, they're kind of like that feeling that they were throwing spaghetti against the wall for some of their thought processes. We did give them full points for the resources and existing infrastructure, just because we felt like those were both strong submissions, especially given the fact that for the use of existing infrastructure, they talk about the money that's coming in and how they're going to be revitalizing some of the infrastructure all on their own, and that they're trying to refocus on this core area and try to reduce the amount of urban sprawl for the city. So we thought those were strong. Where we thought they had a weaker response was definitely in the revitalization section. And then for the description section, we dinged them a few points here or there, but we felt like those were pretty good responses. So that was it for us.
Thanks, John. Sally, I think you had the other group.
Yep, we had a good discussion about section 1 of Barberton's assessment grant, and Robert has volunteered to be our spokesperson.
Well, we gave them 40 points. We thought that they hit most of the points in the criteria that we reviewed, although the points made by the two previous reviewers, by Mr. West and Ms. Hodder, we thought I can see where those observations can be made. We thought that as to the overview, we thought that after reading it, we had a good sense of where the area was, the impacts to the area, and we felt like we were a mesh there. It clearly described the target areas and the boundaries for the grant action. We thought that the one thing that we liked a lot, and I'm going to give credit where credit's due to Sally on this, is she made the comment, and I asked her to repeat it so I could get it correct, was assessment grants need to be catalytic and strategic. And we believe that looking at what they described historically and where they're going and using the city plan. They have two city plans. One is a master plan and one is the bike plan. We thought that it was very well conceived, and it just wasn't an opportunistic use. Now, as to and I want to get to what we really liked was they talked about how the city had been basically there's not a lot, through a loss of 600 acres, there's not a lot of developable area in downtown, and how the city had been basically bisected or bifurcated into east and west sides. And whether that has to do with the highway system or transportation system, that we understood that as well. However, we believe that they're trying to connect using this grant to not only assess, but they are going to, come with 1,000 homes. They're going to connect to a local industrial park. They're going to connect the cities with the bike paths and with the Erie tow bridge path, doing things that we think are the underpinnings for sustained economic growth, which will not just be growing now, but going in the future. We like the fact that they did use, if you go down to the infrastructure, but prior to that they were going to use PACE program for some of the goals, which clearly it's just not land redevelopment for land redevelopment's sake and then find a purpose. It's more targeted, and we like the fact that they were using the PACE program for tenant improvements and also for energy savings, and to have eligible energy improvement projects with regard to HVAC insulation, electric upgrades, and window and roof replacements, which is a kind of a parallel contemporaneous goal of this program as well, not just to clean up the brownfield site, but also to have those other goals and objectives set forth. And the last thing is we did like their use of the infrastructure, and we did note that we took reading what they had been given using the Ohio Abandoned Gas Station Cleanup Program, the Jobs Ohio Revitalization Fund, the Ohio EPA Revolving Loan Fund. We took that more than just looking at that as a laundry list, but more that they understand where those grant opportunities are. And then the use of the infrastructure, the transportation and what they've done cannot be understated, especially if you know where Summit County is in Barberton as a bedroom community of Akron. And they also, the one thing is that they are using that Worcester. There was a corridor for I-76 along Worcester Road to improve connections to their industrial businesses. So we thought that they hit the points, and we gave them a 40 out of 40. So maybe we were easier graders. I don't know. That's it for our group.
Thanks, Robert. I think one of the really great points to make for this exercise is that you are going to have different reviewers with different backgrounds and different expertise looking at this. And so it's just good to see how different reviewers will look at it. And that's kind of the whole point of this exercise, so that you can kind of make sure to look at it with maybe a more critical eye from that point of view. For section 2, Amy?
Our report out is going to be done by Corinne Vogel. And if you'd introduce yourself, she's got a position you may want to know about in the future. And also, if I can share my screen, I have all the information on it.
Yes. So hi, I'm Corinne Vogel. I'm with Ohio EPA. So I am the new supervisor for the Brownfields program. So this is my, I'm not very experienced in brownfields, but this is my first experience with it. So we're getting there. But I have been around in Ohio EPA for a long time doing VAP and remedial and enforcement. So I am here. So all right. So we did section 2. So our total was 37 out of 40, I believe. So we thought that this section was pretty good. We had started awarding 4.5s until we learned that was not something we could do. But so some of our scoring is 4.5. So we really thought, a lot of these sections were pretty well done. So for like the community's need for funding, they had given percentiles to kind of characterize low income status, which was good. They had stated there's a small population, but they didn't really characterize it in terms of like national averages. And they had mentioned resources, different funding resources, but they didn't really have sufficient information on that. So because of that, we gave a 4.5. With health or welfare of sensitive populations, they used a lot of percentiles, which was good. But one of the things we saw was that they didn't link the releases or like the source areas with the actual health effects. So it was kind of just glossed over. It's kind of generalized, like we had some industries and then here's the health effects. So we thought it might have been better to link the specific releases and businesses that released materials and then link that with the health effects they were talking about, mostly inhalation and things like that. And we also thought this section should have talked more about bringing in technical jobs as part of that. So we awarded a 4.5 for that section. Okay, so then the greater than normal incidence of disease, we thought that one was very good. I think we awarded a 5 for that one. So they did, like I said, they explained percentages. They had a lot of statistics in this, which was good. So they explained the percentages of the health outcomes in terms of, they compared them to like state and national percentages. So that was good. It really showed the disadvantages of this community. And then, like I said earlier, they didn't explain the specific sources enough, but we think that overall that section was pretty good. Oh, they also mentioned collecting data with the health department. So I think that is a key thing that they mentioned as well. Okay, so then environmental justice. So they explained how the proportion of minority residents was higher in the target area versus the city. So we thought that was very good. Overall, the environmental justice sections were very good. So we awarded 5s for both of those sections. And then community project involvement. So they had listed several groups in the community. They were missing, you know, like a church group or something like that. We were thinking they didn't really link also, like they didn't explain how the groups that they listed were actually involved with the target population. So they could have said like, you know, we know this group is involved with this population. They, you know, work with them, but they kind of glossed over that. So I think for the project roles though, where they list the community partner and then the role, those were pretty well, you know, described. So we awarded a 5 for that part, but we awarded a 4 for the part about the incorporating community input. Like I said, because they didn't explain how those groups would actually be associated with the target population. I think that was it. So yeah, so overall, I think we thought it was pretty well done, had a lot of statistics, and there were just a few things missing, like the link between the releases and health effects, and then the links between the community groups and the actual target population. With the community involvement too, we thought that they had a good plan for like the meetings and stuff like that. So yeah, overall, we thought it was pretty good.
Thanks, Corin. I think our group was last, and Trey Hendrick is going to report out for us, and I can share my screen as well. Amy, do you want to stop sharing? All right, Trey.
Hey everyone, sorry about that, I was on mute. So for the community needs section, we actually gave full points for that. For community need for funding, we did full points on that for demonstrating the economic struggles, low income, high dependence on aid, job losses. For the sensitive populations, we gave them full points for that, for showing significant health impacts on the vulnerable groups. For the greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health effects, we gave full points for that. So overall for community need, we gave full 15 points there. For environmental justice, we gave 9 out of 10 points, full 5 points for identification of environmental justice. We thought they did pretty thorough identification of all the environmental justice issues, focused on the racial disparities and the overrepresentation of certain populations. For advancing environmental justice, we did give them 4 out of 5 points. They were close to the full points, obviously, but what we thought is they were missing some detail on why the target area specifically needed redeveloped to address this environmental justice. So that accounted for us giving them 4 out of the 5 points there. For community engagement, for project involvement, we gave them 4 out of 5 points there as well. They received the full 4 out of 5 points because they listed partners, but we would have liked to see them explain their roles and how they impacted the target area a little bit more detailed descriptions for each partners. We thought that was kind of lacking there in that section. For project roles, we gave them 5 out of 5. We thought they clearly defined relevant partner roles, local engagement, health focus, and then for incorporating community input, we gave them 5 out of 5 points there as well. Full points for their approach to how they approach community engagement, identifying a diverse task force, extensive communication strategies there. So that was also 5 out of 5. So pretty good score overall for us on section 2.
Thanks, Trey. We only have a few minutes left for wrap up. I think we might have a few questions. Do you guys see any questions in the chat?
Yes, there is a question about wouldn't it be difficult to link specific releases to specific health effects? Unlikely, unless you already had extensive studies, an example given like Love Canal.
Beth, do you want to take that?
Oh, I was just going to say that yes, when you're talking about releases, yeah, that would be difficult. However, you can talk about suspected contamination on certain properties, be it petroleum, be it vinyl chloride or other chlorinated compounds, and link them to health effects. So it's not a direct link, but you could actually, if it's asking for linkage in the grant and under certain areas, you could link this to more of suspected contamination and how it is likely affecting your target area population. But releases, absolutely, that takes more study.
And you can get that type of data from ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic and Substance. All right, well, ATSDR, they have great fact sheets on this type of thing.
Yeah, and ATSDR, there is a link to them, and there's a document under the resources as far as links that will assist grant writers. Different census links, EJ links, ATSDR links, Department of Labor links, things like that that will provide you with a lot of information that can be helpful while writing your grant.
Awesome, thank you. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. I just want to thank all of our fantastic speakers for sharing their time and expertise today. If you would like to reach out to anyone at KSU TAB, our information is here as well as on the website. You can reach out to us about anything regarding any aspect of your project. We hope to see you again tomorrow as we round out the second day of the 2-day workshop. Tomorrow you will need to learn, we will learn more about the tools that can help elevate your grant application that we kind of saw in the sections today, and then how to gather the data needed to be competitive. We will also walk through another group exercise looking at section 3 of a successful grant. It's already been mentioned multiple times, but if you have not already, please take the time to fill out a survey. It is really valuable feedback for us, and it is how we keep this program relevant for you. And with that, I just want to thank you all again for participating today. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. We have 2 minutes for any additional questions or thoughts that we haven't gotten to. Feel free to put them in the chat box, and otherwise we will see you tomorrow.